Even though I don't lead an interesting life, I always share this story when someone asks me for a scary one. I was going to enter my sophomore year of high school at the age of 15. I grew up in a normal beach town that was crowded with tourists in the summer, but quickly turned into a ghost town when the season was over. Only the residents, the sky, and the ocean remain after the bars and restaurants have closed. I would highly suggest going down the shore in the off-season if you haven't already. It's among the oddest, yet most peaceful sensations life has to offer. Despite how corny it may sound, our home is located on Surf Avenue, which is just one block from the ocean. Ironically, I'm a competent surfer. To be honest, it would be quite pitiful if I lived on Surf Avenue and had no idea how to get around. Sand and the boardwalk had always been part of my routine because I had spent my entire childhood there. To tell the truth, it's very close to a part of my personality. Even though I don't live there anymore, the house still feels like a part of me because it has remained in the family. I was on the cross-country varsity team at my high school at the time, and I had a slight obsession with maintaining my fitness, even in the off-season. I normally ran really early in the morning or late at night, when I wouldn't sweat in the heat or have to be that jerk weaving in between crowds, because summers down the shore become unbelievably hot. I made the decision to go for a late-night run that evening. I had little choice because I had slept in that morning after staying up rather late with several friends the previous evening. When I went for a run, I never had my phone with me. Not having music was always bothersome, but even that tiny bit of extra weight would be enough to make me lose my mind. I had this rickety little Garmin watch that I used to track pace and distance. I'm not sure whether they still make those. My house keys would be the only additional item I would bring. To put it gently, I had no choice but to carry my house keys in my shorts pocket whenever I went for a run, even if my parents weren't home, because they were so strict about keeping the house secured. It was one of those rules that could not be changed, particularly considering that the majority of private beach communities are often extremely safe. I still don't fully understand why my parents were so worried about it. I made the decision to spend that evening on the boardwalk. Although it wasn't as harsh as running on the sand, the surface was just soft enough to be easy on my legs. I used to occasionally jog on the beach for a challenge, but after the day I'd had, that wasn't happening. All I wanted was a long, pleasant run with no variation in terrain or elevation. That's what the boardwalk would provide me. After a few kilometers, I began to nod off while experiencing the exuberant runner's high. Even now, I usually advise people to break over their initial mental barrier that appears after roughly 3 miles. The remainder of the run is simple and somewhat pleasurable. Anyway, I was trying to simultaneously listen to the sound of my shoes hitting the wood and pay attention to the distant ocean noises. I was in such a wonderful rhythm that you forgot you were jogging at all. Then I heard it, though. A little clink. I paused and looked in my pocket. Empty. My stomach fell. My keys were there. I knelt and looked through the openings in the boardwalk. However, it was pointless. I wouldn't even be able to get them out of where I was because it was completely dark underneath. I literally started yelling out loud and cursing. I realized that sounded a little corny, but I was still feeling the rush of adrenaline from the exercise, and I was furious that my run had been spoilt by this detour. If I had returned without those keys, I know my parents would have killed me. Thus, without giving it much thought, I sprang off the side and, descending to the beach. Additionally, it was partially a pride issue. I wasn't just going to abandon one of my own possessions. Who was responsible for that? I immediately noticed the scent beneath the boardwalk. It tasted like stale beer combined with rotten seaweed. To be honest, that's the best way to put it. Imagine literally pouring beer and seaweed into a bathtub. It was thick and wet. Additionally, I picked up trash and sand with every step I took. As previously mentioned, I was not carrying my phone, so my watch's backlight served as my primary source of guidance, and it wasn't doing much. I crouched down to where I believed my keys had gone missing. They were not visible at all, just more trash bits and sand clumps. I'll say it again. Even though it was terrible, I had to have the keys. I considered simply leaving them, but ultimately realized that I had come this far and that going back now would mean I had wasted my time becoming coated in trash and smell. I thought that perhaps they had dropped beneath the surface, so I tried moving the sand around a little, but after a few minutes, irritation began to set in. Had I indeed miscalculated the location by that much? The most logical explanation, I decided, was that I had somehow miscalculated where they had fallen. I ascended once again to the boardwalk, paused where I had been running, and considered how I could be certain of a location underneath. I had the brilliant notion to use my shoelace as a marker at that point. I dropped to my knees, untied it, and put it between the planks to hang. In this manner, I could readily spot it from below by crawling back beneath the boardwalk. Something tugged on the lace as I was getting back up, and it vanished into the crack right away. It's not a breeze, and I'm not acting strangely. Something from the bottom. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was genuinely stunned. It had been pulled. I retreated a step and stood where my shoelace had been moments before. Someone was underneath the boardwalk. I was able to connect the dots right away. My keys were most likely also in the possession of whoever was underneath. My initial reaction was to flee home and deal with it later. But the idea of someone knowing where I lived and possessing my house keys made my blood boil. I couldn't just give a stranger that type of access because our home address was inscribed on them. I'm still not sure why I did it. Call it foolish adolescent self-confidence, but I took a big breath, sprang back into the sand, and went beneath once more. The second time, something felt different. The air felt heavier, and I was preparing for a battle of some sort. I heard faint shuffling somewhere ahead of me at one point. I clenched my chest. I turned my watch light in the direction of the sound, but I couldn't see anything. Just more beams and sand. I held on to, shifting, and once more I heard shuffling. From an alternative angle this time. I noticed then that the noise wasn't originating from a single location. There were several persons underneath. For me, that was sufficient. I was hit by common reason like a freight train. What on earth could I have possibly anticipated? Was all I was going to do was battle a crackhead who lived beneath the boardwalk? It was suicide. I try not to panic as I turn to leave the area. However, something chilly grabbed hold of my ankle before I could fully exit. It was sand. I let out a painful scream as my fingernails dug into my flesh. I didn't consider. I simply kicked as hard as I could. When my foot made contact with something, the person gripping my ankle released their grip. I pulled myself out into the sand and wood, my arms and knees scratching against it as I scrambled away. Outside, I continued to run. I immediately ran back to my residence. I beat on the front door till my dad opened it when I got there. To say that he was furious would be a huge understatement. He was furious. He didn't become physical with me, which shocked me. I explained everything to him before he lost it. The shoelace, the keys, and the individuals beneath the boardwalk. My mother was awakened by the ruckus and initially became enraged. However, her attitude changed to one of more horror when she noticed the wounds on my ankle. My father didn't spend any time. After he called the police, we had a locksmith come out the following morning to replace all of the house's locks. For a few days, everything seemed normal once more. That seemed to be the end of it. It was just a strange, chaotic night that I would attempt to forget. However, a few mornings later, I heard a loud bang on the front door when I woke up. It was early. It's far too early for guests. I waited for my parents to go take care of it as I sat in bed. When neither of them did, I made the decision to handle it myself. After getting ready, I went downstairs. When I peered through the spy hole, nobody was there. Bewildered, I opened the door and peered around. There was nobody to be seen. I looked about the street. No people, no cars. I was just about to shut the door when I caught a glimpse of something unexpected. One of the shoelaces was on the doormat. My shoelace, the one from that evening. Without another thinking, I slammed the door shut. That afternoon, we had a security system installed. Following that, my family spent weeks living in continuous terror, but nothing came of it. I'm still unable to explain what happened when I reflect on this encounter. The thing about living in a beach town during the off-season is that it feels abandoned. And even though I no longer live there, it still kind of worries me out that some random stranger knows where our beach house is. The businesses are largely boarded up. The visitors have long left. And the boardwalk, which serves as the town's summertime hub, is reduced to a barren shell. Nonetheless, I enjoy it. It's quiet. That's why I've been going for late-night runs on the boardwalk during the off-season when nobody else is around for the longest. It serves as my cleanse from life and all of its pressures. There are moments when you just need to be alone. Something about my sneakers' constant slap against the wooden planks and the sound of the waves soothed me. It gave me the impression that I was alone in the world. It was the same tonight. There was a distinct smell of salt and damp wood in the cool air. The only sources of light were sporadic street lamps that glowed dimly and created long, lonesome shadows. When I experienced that feeling, the one when you know you're not alone, I was perhaps a mile in. I took a look over my shoulder. In the distance, a man was standing on the boardwalk, facing me, without moving or even strolling. I swallowed and shook it off as I turned around. It was most likely nothing more than a local going for a stroll. In all honesty, though, that will still be a frightening sight to witness. I continued to run. However, a few minutes later, the sensation of being watched or followed returned with even more intensity. My heart pounded more ferociously, but not because I was exerting myself. The need to turn around grew stronger. I turned around once more. A deep, crawling uneasiness formed in my gut as he drew closer, still standing there, facing me and not moving. I sped up the pace and pulled out the one headphone I had with me. My breath came more quickly when my feet banged against the wood. However, I occasionally heard footsteps behind me that matched mine. I turned once more. Even though he had come closer, he remained motionless. I launched myself into a run. The once calm boardwalk seemed to stretch too far in both directions, like an endless trap. My vehicle was parked directly at the beach entry at the very end. I simply had to get there. I ran more vigorously than I had ever done. My legs screamed and my lungs burned, but I wouldn't stop. I glanced over every few seconds to make sure, and each time he was a little closer, still standing and maintaining eye contact. I couldn't figure out how he managed to halt so abruptly each time I turned around. I was so concentrated on getting away that I wasn't even looking in the direction I was traveling. When I finally spotted my car on the boardwalk exit, I almost burst into tears of relief. My hands were shaking so much that I could hardly hit the unlock button as I searched for my keys. When the lights finally flashed, I went inside and slammed the door. I backed the car out of the area and inserted the key into the ignition. I looked ahead when I put the car in drive to spin the wheel to the left to leave, and the man was standing in front of my car, exactly where it had just been. However, I gave him such a fleeting glance that I was unable to even discern any features. All I could see was that he had a respectable portion of his face covered by his hood. I didn't give a damn if I swerved, ran a red light, or almost spun out. All I did was drive. I didn't turn around. I locked every window, door, and other opening as soon as I arrived home. I didn't sleep that night, and I've had a few nightmares about it in which the man showed up in some capacity, either pursuing me or monitoring me. Since then, I haven't gone for a winter run on the boardwalk. This took place last summer. With a group of pals, I was 22, and we were staying at the cheapest Airbnb we could locate for a beachside weekend. It was the final evening of our visit. All night long, we had been sitting around a bonfire on the beach, chatting, drinking, and hanging out. Nothing extraordinary. Most of my companions were ready to call it quits by the end, but I wasn't yet worn out. After walking off the buzz for a while, I thought I would find my way to the Airbnb. There's a certain tranquility about the boardwalk at night. Everything is vacant. Since I haven't been to the beach often, everything was novel and fascinating to me. I wandered about for a while before realizing I needed to go to the bathroom. My buddies frequently make fun of me since I'm not the kind of guy who just does it in public, but I did see one of those public boardwalk restrooms. Old, dilapidated, and dimly lit. I didn't feel like holding it till I returned, which isn't ideal. I instantly felt bad for pushing the door open. The place had a terrible scent, like bleach mixed with whatever it was trying to hide. I went to the farthest stall because I thought I'd make it quickly. I heard the door creak open once more at that point. I winced because I was upset about losing my privacy. I moved around gently. It was strange that they appeared to be moving around the restroom. I wasn't positive, but occasionally I believed the footfall were coming from different directions, like if there were numerous people. They eventually came to a stop close to the sinks. Simply ceased. Nothing, no coughing, no movement. I wasn't really sure what they were doing because the water didn't turn on either. I was eager to leave after finishing up, but the stall door remained in place when I tried to push it open. I moved the latch, but the door remained stuck. I wanted to strike the door of the stall. I felt so uneasy and furious at that point, but then the footsteps resumed. This time they were closer, and I felt a very dirty sensation in my chest. The door seemed to be held shut by someone. I attempted to push the door with my shoulder, but it didn't work. A portion of my brain started making connections as the adrenaline started to pump in. I made the decision that I would not simply sit there like a defenseless target. With all the strength I could summon, I rushed the door until it eventually gave way and I staggered out. I saw the bathroom door swing shut as I rushed out of the stall, as if someone had just left. Now that the restroom was empty, I looked around. It seems to have vanished. After quickly washing my hands, I left the area. I reached for the door handle, but it remained in place. The handle refused to turn at all, as though the restroom had been barred from the outside. I froze. My thoughts were racing at that moment. Was this a joke of some sort? I assumed that one of my pals may be cheating on me, but it didn't make any sense. All of them had already departed. I was very terrified out at that point, by the way, so I simply gritted my teeth and began hammering on the door. I called out to whoever was out there to open up, but I received no response. At that moment, I heard activity coming from one of the stalls behind me. I quickly turned my head and realized that there was someone in one of those stalls despite the fact that I couldn't see anything. This implied that there had been two people present the entire time. They must have been standing on one of the toilets, which was even more worrisome, because I couldn't see any feet beneath any of the doors. I considered phoning the police, but I had to get to safety first. I was in danger. A dirty window near the ceiling caught my attention. Although it wasn't large, I had no other choice. Under it, I climbed onto what I actually believed to be a window, the sink. Behind me, one of the stall doors flew open, and I met a man's gaze. He had the palest skin I've ever seen and was extremely hairy. Although he was dressed like a teenager, this man must have been over 50 years old. I didn't waste any more time. I clambered the last distance through the window and landed on the boardwalk. Even though my knees struck the floor with force, I didn't mind. I simply ran. I was safe overall once I got a safe distance away, but that guy had already left by the time they investigated the bathroom. The boardwalk was dead in that area. It's not like there were any cameras they could check, because there are no cameras and no stores open that late. One of the officers pointed to the scratches on the bathroom door handle, stating that it appeared someone had tampered with it, after I showed them where everything had fallen. The following day, I had to leave the beach, so I never received any kind of update on the matter. In any case, I doubt the cops ever conducted a thorough investigation. I apologize in advance for any confusion this story may have caused, but it happened when I was very little. I'm not sure how old I was at the time. I think I was 8 or 9, but I do know it happened during one of the summers my family spent at my grandparents' beach cottage. It was comparable to the family hub. My brothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, and a large group of us would gather for a few days or weeks each summer. Although the property wasn't very elegant or anything, it had a ton of bedrooms and could comfortably accommodate our entire family. Additionally, it was very close to the beach, so I would spend whole days riding my bike around the neighborhood and playing in the sand. Every summer I spent there was incredible. It felt like a prolonged fever dream, particularly now that I'm growing more and more cut off from that happy youth. However, I recall that summer being unique. A large hurricane was predicted, and all of the beach communities were frantically preparing for it months in advance. As a temporary barrier, our beach town constructed these enormous sand dunes along the shore. I'm not sure if other beach towns followed suit. I'm not sure whether it's accurate to refer to them as dunes. They were enormous. To a child, they appeared to be castle walls. I'm willing to wager that the coast would have appeared completely insane from the air at that moment. My siblings and I would think we were mounting mountains or breaking into a fortress as we spent hours climbing the dunes and falling down the opposite side that summer. However, it was strange. As you can surely understand, on the promenade facing the beach, you can typically see the water extending out in front of you. However, The view was totally obscured by those dunes. You would stroll along the boardwalk and see this enormous wall of sand in place of the sea. Additionally, the beach closed at a specific hour, meaning that people were not technically allowed to be on the beach and lifeguards would leave duty. However, that didn't really deter us locals. The village was a safe area where everyone knew one another, and it wasn't a huge thing to let youngsters run around, especially once the tourist hordes had subsided. Our parents didn't mind at all as long as we vowed not to go into the ocean. Furthermore, I was a bit of a problem back then, to be honest. I enjoyed pushing limits, particularly when I believed I could get away with it. I decided to slip out that evening because of it. The sun hadn't yet begun to set, so it wasn't yet dark. But I hadn't asked for permission to leave. All I wanted was some alone time. I believe I got into an argument with one of my brothers, but I can't really recall. It was simple to enter and exit the children's bedrooms without being detected because of the sliding door downstairs. I would learn from my older relatives, who had essentially written the manual on how to sneak in and out, usually for far more rebellious reasons than a lone beach walk. We still make jokes about how simple it was to enter and exit the house covertly without the adults noticing. I would not even bother to wear shoes. I would cover my bare feet, anticipating to run into some locals, possibly even some children my age. I headed toward the boardwalk. Really, everyone who owned or was staying a house down there was still frequently present. Even after beach hours, I was a little taken aback by how vacant it was. It seemed a bit odd. I'm not referring to any individual outside. In all honesty, it felt abandoned. I briefly strolled along the boardwalk, but I never did. The entire beach seemed to be asleep that night or something. I was on turn around when I saw something disturbing. A tiny trail of smoke was visible coming up from behind one of the dunes. I initially believed it to be merely fog, but after giving it more attention, I realized it was smoke, somewhat like smoke from a fire. Smoking on the beach wasn't all that strange. Tourists occasionally lighted bonfires, despite the fact that it was almost prohibited and completely against beach laws. However, there was something about the night's emptiness that made the smoke feel strange. I thought it appeared to be a volcano because the smoke seemed to be coming straight from the sand dunes. I searched for an adult, but I couldn't find one. Only the deserted boardwalk extending in both directions. Curiosity overcame me, even though I should have gone home. Additionally, I climbed the sand dune a short distance away from the smoke. As my parents had told me, I was buried in sand by the time I got to the summit. When I looked down the opposite side, I saw what I had anticipated, a bonfire. The peculiar aspect is that it was totally alone. Nobody was in the area. There were no coolers, chairs, or anything else. There is only a fire burning in the center of a deserted beach, as though the person who started it had left it there. I didn't feel comfortable with it. I understood it was risky to leave a fire like that, even at that age. I moved toward the dune after sliding down it. I just stood there and stared at it for a moment. Since I had nothing else to do, I just began kicking sand onto it. I repeatedly doing it till the flames were out. I wasn't ready to leave it just yet. I was just too intrigued. Unless they were attempting to commit a crime or something. I couldn't think of a reason why someone would start a fire and then leave it going. I looked into the fire pit further and found some unsettling things. First, there were garments. Clothing for young children that is similar to what I would wear. Children's socks, shoes, and partially burned textiles. I knelt down and poked around with a stick. I became really ill when I discovered that the majority of the material in the fire had been clothing. Then I understood what else had been on fire. Pictures, or what was left of them, anyway. The majority were completely burned, but one had lasted long enough for me to spot a face. It was a boy, most likely my age. In all honesty, he looked somewhat like me, and I would believe my parents if they told me he was a distant cousin or anything. I was frightened by the picture. Even though I was still a young child, I felt the urge to run. Obviously, I had never experienced something that terrifying before, so I was completely freaking out. However, things became much worse. From somewhere far away, I heard someone say, "Hey, hi." When I looked up, I saw a man approaching from the beach. Even though he was bald, I couldn't make out much of his face from a distance. He was also stumbling. Every few steps, as though he were struggling to keep his feet from tripping. It appeared as though he was intoxicated or worse. He said, "Hey, kid," and began to approach me a little faster, but I was immobile. I was paralyzed with fear and locked in place. For me, he yelled, "Don't go anywhere," and that was it. At last, my tiny brain managed to, up to my body, and I began sprinting in the direction of the sand wall. Running was difficult in the sand, but I thought I was in a life-or-death situation. I could hear him shouting profanity behind me as I began to ascend the dune, and he was getting closer. My ankle was being clawed by fingernails when I got to the top. Through some miracle, he was never able to hold me, and I leaped over the dune, plummeting to the bottom. I ran home after sprinting for the boardwalk. I glanced back a few of times to make sure he wasn't following me, but I continued to run as if my life hinged on it. Upon arriving home, I broke down in tears. I desired to inform my parents. I truly did, but all I could think was, worried how I would sneak away and how much trouble I would be in, so I didn't say anything. In hindsight, I realize I ought to have said something. At the very least, I should have told my parents, but I chose not to, and nothing ever happened. To the best of my knowledge, there were no police or journalistic reports at the beach the following day. There are no reports of missing kids or anything similar. I'm still not sure how to interpret this. Although that was a long time ago, I can't help but believe that there is more to the tale. The thing that scares me the most, I believe, is how much the child in those pictures resembles me. There are moments when I wish I could go back in time and tell my younger self to just come clean, but that's only something I will have to put up with.